Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today. This is the Bodega Cat Book Club Spiritual Edition. And today we're going to continue our reading of Flow by Mihaly Mr. C. I call him Mr. C because I don't know how to pronounce his name. Anyways, this book was inspired by an animated film with the same name. And I'll leave the official website link below in the description box. You guys can check it out. I don't think they have any association. I mean, I don't think the movie and the book has any association, but I thought it was kind of interesting. Um, yeah, the animated film is worth checking it out if you could find it. I think it's probably streaming right now, um, in like Amazon Prime or something like that if you have it. Um, and it won an Academy Award, so congratulations for best animated feature, I think it was. So. Anyways, let's get started. And today we'll be reading chapter 7, and this is part 1. Okay, chapter 7, work as flow. All right, I'm going to move the camera in just a little bit so you guys can see. There are some areas where I highlighted with a yellow highlighter. That means that there is a footnote in the back of the book, and we will be reading that. It's not an exact science because sometimes there are phrases that he mentioned in the back of the footnote that I can't find in the chapter. So, anyways, sorry. We will go with the flow, as they say, right? Okay, like other animals, we must spend a large part of our existence making a living. Calories needed to fuel the body don't disappear magically on the table, and houses and cars don't assemble themselves spontaneously. There are no strict formulas, however, for how much time people actually have to work. It seems, for instance, that the early gather-hunterers, like their present-day descendants living in the inhospitable deserts of Africa and Australia, spent only 3 to 5 hours each day on what we would call working, providing for food, shelter, clothing, and tools. They spend the rest of the day in conversation, resting, or dancing. At the opposite extreme were the industrial workers of the 19th century, who were often forced to spend 24-hour days, 6 days a week, toiling in grim factories or dangerous mines. Not only the quantity of work, but its quality has been highly variable. There is an old Italian saying, oh boy, I challenge my Italian here. Il lavoro libolita l'uomo e lo rende simile alle bestie. Sorry if I butchered that. Or work gives man nobility and turns him into an animal. This iconic trope may be a comment on the nature of all work, but it can also be interpreted to mean that work requiring great skills and that is done freely refines the complexity of the self. And on the other hand, that there are few things as entropic as unskilled work done under compulsion. The brain surgeon operating in a shining hospital and the slave laborer who staggers under a heavy load as he wades through the mud are both working. But the surgeon has a chance to learn new things every day. And every day he learns that he is in control and that he can perform difficult tasks. The laborer is forced to repeat the same exhausting motions, and what he learns is mostly about his own helplessness. Because work is so universal, yet so varied, it makes a tremendous difference to one's overall contentment, whether what one does for a living is enjoyable or not. Thomas Carlyle was not far wrong when he wrote, "Blessed is he who has found his work. Let him ask no other blessedness." Sigmund Freud amplified somewhat on this simple advice. When asked for his recipe for happiness, he gave a very short but sensible answer: work and love. It is true that if one finds flow in work and in relations with other people, One is well on the way toward improving the quality of life as a whole. In this chapter, we shall explore how jobs can provide flow, and in the following one, we shall take up Freud's other main theme, enjoying the company of others. Okay, let's read what the footnote has to say. Oops. Okay. For the time budget allocated to work by pre-literate people, see the excellent volume by Marshall Solons, 1972, and the estimates of Lee, 1975. Some glimpses of the working patterns of medieval Europe are to be found in Le Goff, 1980, and Leroy Ladorie, 1979. The pattern of the working day of typical English workers before and after the advent of the Industrial Revolution is reconstructed by E.P. Thompson, 1963. The changing role of women as workers in the public sector is discussed by, among others, Clark, 1919, and Howell, 1968. Oh, sorry, 1986. Autotelic workers. As punishment for his ambition, Adam was sentenced by the Lord to work the earth with the sweat of his brow. The passage of Genesis, chapter 3, verse 17, that relates this event reflects the way most cultures, and especially those that have reached the complexity of, quote, civilization, conceive of work as a curse to be avoided at all costs. It is true that because of the inefficient way the universe operates, it requires a lot of energy to realize our basic needs and aspirations. As long as we didn't care how much we ate, whether or not we lived in solid and decorated homes, or whether we could afford the latest fruits of technology, the necessity of working would rest lightly on our shoulders, as it does for the nomads of the Kalahari Desert. But the more psychic energy we invest in material goals, and the more improbable the goals grow to be, the more difficult it becomes to make them come true. Then we need increasingly high inputs of labor, mental and physical, as well as inputs of natural resources to satisfy escalating expectations. For much of history, the great majority of people who lived at the periphery of, quote, civilized societies had to give up any hope of enjoying life in order to make the dreams of the few who had found a way of exploiting them come true. The achievements that set civilized nations apart from the more primitive, such as the pyramids, the Great Wall of China, the Taj Mahal, and the temples, palaces, and dams of antiquity, were usually built with the energy of slaves forced to realize their rulers' ambitions. Not surprisingly, work required a rather poor reputation. Sorry, work acquired a rather poor reputation. With all due respect to the Bible, however, it does not seem to be true that work necessarily needs to be unpleasant. It may always have to be hard, or at least harder than doing nothing at all. But there is ample evidence that work can be enjoyable, and that indeed it is often the most enjoyable part of life. Occasionally, cultures evolve in such a way as to make everyday productive chores as close to flow activities as possible. There are groups in which both work and family life are challenging, yet harmoniously integrated. In the high mountain valleys of Europe, the alpine villages spared by the Industrial Revolution, communities of this type still exist. Curious to see how work is experienced in a quote, traditional setting, representative of farming lifestyles that were prevalent everywhere up to a few generations ago, a team of Italian psychologists led by Professor Fausto Massimini and Dr. Antonella Delle Fave recently interviewed some of their inhabitants and have generously shared their exhaustive transcripts. The most striking feature of such places is that those who live there can seldom distinguish work from free time. It could be said that they work 16 hours a day each day, and then it could also be argued that they never work. One of the inhabitants, Serafina Vinon, a 76-year-old woman from a tiny hamlet of Trantas in the Val Oasta, in the Val d'Aosta region of the Italian Alps, still gets up at 5 in the morning to milk her cows. Afterwards, she cooks a huge breakfast, cleans the house, and depending on the weather and time of year, either takes the herd to the meadows just below the glaciers, tends to the orchard, or carts some wool. In summer, she spends weeks on the high pastures cutting hay and then carries huge bales of it on her head and the several miles down to the barn. She could reach the barn in half the time if she took a direct route, but she prefers following invisible winding trails to save the slopes from erosion. In the evening, she may read or tell stories to her great grandchildren, or play the accordion for one of the parties of friends and relatives that assemble at her house a few times a week. Serafina knows every tree, every boulder, every feature of the mountains as if they were old friends. Family legends going back many centuries are linked to the landscape. On this old stone bridge, when the plague of 1473 had exhausted itself, one night the last surviving woman of Serafina's village, with a torch in her hand, met the last surviving man of the village further down the valley. They helped each other, got married, and became the ancestors of her family. It was in that field of raspberries that her grandmother was lost when she was a little girl. On this rock, standing with a pitchfork in his hand, the devil threatened Uncle Andrew during the freak snowstorm of 24. When Serafina was asked what she enjoys doing most in life, she had no trouble answering. Milking the cows, taking them to the pasture, pruning the orchard, carding wool. In effect, what she enjoys most is what she has been doing for a living all along. In her own words, it gives me a great satisfaction to be outdoors, to talk with people, to be with my animals. I talk to everybody plants, birds, flowers, animals. Everything in nature keeps you company. You see nature progress every day. You feel you see nature progress every day. You feel clean and happy. Too bad that you get tired and have to go home. Even when you have to work a lot, even when you have to work a lot, it is very beautiful. Okay, let's read about the Serafina Vinon. Serafina Vinon is one of the respondents in the group studied by Del Fave and Massimini, 1988. Her quote, "It gives me great satisfaction, is from page 203. Okay. When she was asked, when she was asked what she would do if she had all the time and money in the world, Serafina laughed and repeated the same list of activities. She would milk the cows, take them to pasture, tend the orchard, card wool. It is not that Serafina is ignorant of the alternatives offered by urban life. She watches television occasionally and reads news magazines, and many of her younger relatives live in large cities and have comfortable lifestyles with cars, appliances, and exotic vacations. But the more fashionable and modern way of life does not attract Serafina. She is perfectly content and serene with the role she plays in the universe. 10 of the oldest residents of Pontrentas, ranging from 66 to 82 years of age, were all interviewed. All of them gave responses similar to Serafina's. None of them drew a sharp distinction between work and free time. All mentioned work as a major source of optimal experiences, and none would want to work less if given a chance. Most of their children, who were also interviewed, expressed the same attitude toward life. However, among the grandchildren aged between 20 and 20 and 33 years, more typical attitudes toward work prevailed. Given a chance, they would have worked less and spend more time instead in leisure, reading, sports, traveling, seeing the latest shows. Partly, this difference between the generations is a matter of age. Young people are usually less contented with their lot, more eager for change, and more intolerant of the constraints of routine. But in this case, the divergence also reflects the erosion of a traditional way of life in which work was meaningfully related to people's identities and to their ultimate goals. Some of the young people in Pointe-Trentaz might, in their old age, come to feel about their work as Serafina does. Probably the majority will not. Instead, they will keep widening the gap between jobs that are necessary but unpleasant and leisure pursuits that are enjoyable but have little complexity. Life in this alpine village has never been easy. To survive from day to day, excuse me, each person had to master a very broad range of difficult challenges, ranging from plain hard work to skillful crafts to the preservation and elaboration of a distinctive language, of songs, of artworks, of complex traditions. Yet somehow the culture has evolved in such a way that the people living in it find these tasks enjoyable. Instead of feeling oppressed by the necessity to work hard, they share the opinion of Jul- Juliana B., a 74-year-old lady. I am free, free in my work because I do whatever I want. If I don't do something today, I will do it tomorrow. I don't have a boss. I am the boss of my own life. I have kept my freedom and I have fought for my freedom. Certainly not all pre-industrial cultures were this idyllic. In many hunting or farming societies, life was harsh, brutish, and short. In fact, some of the alpine communities not far from Pont Chantas were described by foreign travelers of the last century as riddled with hunger, disease, and ignorance. To perfect a lifestyle capable of balancing harmoniously human goals with the resources of the environment is as rare a feat as building one of the great cathedrals that fill visitors with awe. We cannot generalize from one successful example to all pre-industrial cultures, but by the same token, even one exception is sufficient to disprove the notion that work must always be less enjoyable than freely chosen leisure. But what about the case of an urban laborer whose work is not so clearly tied to his subsistence? Serafina's attitude, as it happens, is not unique to traditional farming villages. We can occasionally find it around us in the midst of the turmoils in the industrial age. A good example is the case of Joe Kramer, a man we interviewed in one of our early studies of the flow experience. Joe was in his early 60s, a welder in a South Chicago plant where railroad cars are assembled. About 200 people work with Joe in three huge dark hangar-like structure where steel plates weighing several tons move around suspended from overhead tracks and are wielded amid showers of sparks to the wheelbases of freight cars. In summer, it is an oven. Sorry. In winter, the icy winds of the prairie howl through. The clanging of metal is always so intense that one must shout into a person's ear to make oneself understood. Joe came to the United States when he was 5 years old. He left school after fourth grade. He had been working at this plant for over 30 years, but never wanted to become a foreman. He declined several promotions, claiming that he liked being a simple welder and felt uncomfortable being anyone's boss. Although he stood on the lowest rung of the hierarchy in the plant, everyone knew Joe and everyone agreed that he was the most important person in the entire factory. The manager stated that if he had five more people like Joe, his plant would be the most efficient in the business. His fellow workers said that without Joe, they might as well shut down the shop right now. The reason for his fame was simple. Joe had apparently mastered every phase of the plant's operation, and he was now able to take anyone's place if the necessity arose. Moreover, he could fix any broken down piece of machinery, ranging from huge mechanical cranes to tiny electronic monitors. But what astounded people most was that Joe was not only Um, but what astounded people most was that Joe not only could perform these tasks, but actually enjoyed it when he was called upon to do them. When asked how he learned to deal with complex machines and instruments without having had any formal training, Joe gave a very disarming answer. Since childhood, he had been fascinated with machines of every kind. He was especially drawn to anything that wasn't working properly. Like when my mother's toaster went on the fritz, I asked myself, if I were that toaster and I didn't work, what would be wrong with me? That's cute. I like that. When he disassembled the toaster, found the defect, and fixed it. Ever since, he has used this method of empathic identification to learn about and restore increasingly complex mechanical systems. And the fascination of discovery has never left him. Now close to retirement, Joe still enjoys work every day. Joe has never been a workaholic, completely dependent on the challenges of the factory to feel good about himself. What he did at home was perhaps even more remarkable than his transformation of a mindless, routine job into a complex, flow producing activity. Joe and his wife live in a modest bungalow on the outskirts of the city. Over the years, they bought up the two vacant lots on either side of their house. On these lots, Joe built an intricate rock garden with terraces, paths, and several hundred flowers and shrubs. While he was installing underground sprinklers, Joe had an idea. What if he had them make rainbows? He looked for sprinkler heads that would produce a fine enough mist for this purpose, but none satisfied him. So he designed one himself, and he built it on his basement lath. Now, after work, he could sit on the back porch, and by touching one switch, he could activate a dozen sprays that turned into as many small rainbows. But there was one problem with Joe's little Garden of Eden. Since he worked most days, by the time he got home, the sun was usually too far down the horizon to help paint the water with strong colors. So Joe went back to the drawing board and came back with an admirable solution. He found floodlights that contained enough of the sun's spectrum to form rainbows and installed them inconspicuously around the sprinklers. Now he was really ready. Even in the middle of the night, just by touching two switches, he could surround his house with fans of water, light, and color. Joe is a rare example of what it means to have an autotelic personality, or the ability to create flow experiences even in the most barren environment. An almost inhumane workplace, a weed infested urban neighborhood. In the entire railroad plant, Joe appeared to be the only man who had the vision to perceive challenging opportunities for action. The rest of the welders we interviewed regarded their jobs as burdens to be escaped as promptly as possible. And each evening, as soon as work stopped, they fan out for the saloons that were strategically placed on every third corner of the grid of streets surrounding the factory, there to forget the dullness of the day with beer and camar- camar- camaraderie. Then home for more beer in front of the TV, a brief skirmish with the wife and the day, in all respects similar to each previous one, was over. One might argue here that endorsing Joe's lifestyle over that of his fellow workers was reprehensibly, quote, elitist. After all, the guys in the salon were having a good time. Saloon, saloon. And who is to say that grubbing away in the backyard making rainbows is a better way to spend one's time? By the tenets of cultural relativism, the criticism would be justifiable, of course. But when one understands that enjoyment depends on increasing complexity, it is no longer possible to take such radical relativism seriously. The quality of experience of people who play with and transform the opportunities in their surroundings, as Joe did, is clearly more developed as well as more enjoyable than that of people who resign themselves to live within the constraints of the barren reality they feel they cannot alter. The view that work undertaken as a flow activity is the best way to fulfill human potentialities has been proposed often enough in the past by various religious and philosophical systems. To people imbued with the Christian worldview of the Middle Ages, it made sense to say that peeling potatoes was just as important as building a cathedral, provided they were both done for the greater glory of God. For Karl Marx, men and women constructed their being through productive activities. There is no, quote, human nature, he held, except that which we create through work. Work not only transformed the environment by building bridges across rivers and cultivating barren plains, it also transforms the workers from an animal guided by instincts into a conscious, goal-directed, skillful person. I had this thought many, many, many years ago that God created work so that we won't become depressed. And I think that is true to a certain extent because there was a study that came out, and I don't have the exact studies. If anybody can find it, let me know. Put it in the comment box below. But they did a study of how to cure depression, or what is the treatment for depression. And they're talking about major depression. And this study find that activities helps lift the depressive person out of depression. So always, doing something, the activity of doing. So I don't know. Interesting, eh? Okay, so the quote, "I am free," is from iBit. I wonder, let me see here. What did I finish reading? Complexity. Okay. All right, development and complexity. While most developmental psychology has remained determinately value-free, at least in its rhetoric, if not in its substance, the psychology department at Clark University has maintained a relatively strong value orientation in its approach to human development, based on the notion that complexity is the goal of human growth, e.g. Kaplan, 1983, Werner, 1957, Werner and Kaplan, 1956, for recent attempts in the same direction, see Robinson, 1988, and Freeman and Robinson in Press. Okay. One of the most interesting examples of how the phenomenon of flow appeared to thinkers of earlier times is the concept of you, referred to about 2,300 years ago in the writings of a Taoist scholar, Chuang-Tzu. Yu is a synonym for the right way of following the path, or Tao. It has been translated into English as, quote, wandering, as, quote, walking without touching the ground, or as, quote, swimming, quote, flying, and, quote, flowing. Chuang-Tzu believed that to Yu was the proper way to live, without concern for external reward, spontaneously with total commitment. In short, as a total autotelic experience. As an example of how to live by Yu, or how to flow, Chuang-Tzu presents in the inner chapters of the work, which has come down to us bearing his name, a parable of a humble worker. This character is Ting, a cook whose task was to butcher the meat at the court of Lord Hui of Wei. School children in Hong Kong and Taiwan still have to memorize Chuang-Tzu's description. Ting was cutting up an ox for Lord Wen Hui. At every touch of his hand, every heave of his shoulder, every move of his feet, every thrust of his knee, zip, zoop, he slithered the knife along with a zing, and all was in perfect rhythm, as though he were performing the dance of the mulberry grove or keeping time to the Qing Shao music. Lord Wen Hui was fascinated by how much flow, or yu, his cook found in his work. And so he complimented Ting on his great skill. But Ting denied that it was a matter of skill. What I care about is the way, which goes beyond skill. Then he described how he achieved his superb performance, a sort of mystical, intuitive understanding of the anatomy of the ox, which allowed him to slice it to pieces with what appeared to be automatic ease. Perception and understanding have come to a stop, and spirit moves where it wants. Ting's explanation may seem to imply that yu and flow are the result of different kinds of processes. In fact, some critics have emphasized the differences. While flow is the result of a conscious attempt to master challenges, yu occurs when the individual gives up conscious mastery. Yu occurs when the individual gives up conscious mastery. In this sense, they see flow as an example of the quote Western search for optimal experience, which according to them is based on changing objective conditions, e.g., by confronting challenges with skills, whereas yu is an example of the quote Eastern approach, which disregards objective conditions entirely in favor of spiritual playfulness and the transcendence of actuality. But how is a person to achieve this transcendental experience and spiritual playfulness? In the same parable, Chuangzhu offers a valuable, oops, sorry, valuable insight to answer this question, an insight that has given rise to diametrically opposite interpretations. In Watson's translation, it reads as follows. However, whenever I come to a complicated place, I size up the difficulties, tell myself to watch out and be careful, keep my eyes on what I'm doing, work very slowly, and move my knife with the greatest of subtlety until flop, the whole thing comes apart like a clod of earth, crumbling to the ground. I stand there holding the knife and look all around me, completely satisfied and reluctant to move on, and then I wipe off the knife and put it away. Now, some earlier scholars have taken this passage to refer to the working methods of a mediocre carver who does not know how to hew. More recent ones, such as Watson and Graham, believe that it refers to Ting's own working methods. Based on my knowledge of the flow experience, I believe the latter reading must be the correct one. It demonstrates, even after all the obvious levels of skill and craft, qi, have been mastered, the use still depends on the discovery of new challenges, the quote complicated place, or quote difficulties in the above quotation, and on the development of new skills. Quote, watch out and be careful, keep my eyes on what I'm doing, move my knife with the greatest of subtlety. In other words, the mystical heights of the yu are not attained by some superhuman quantum jump, but simply by the gradual focusing of attention on the opportunities for action in one's environment, which results in a perfection of skills that with time becomes so thoroughly automatic as to seem spontaneous and otherworldly. The performances of a great violinist or a great mathematician seem equally uncanny, even though they can be explained by the incremental honing of challenges and skills. If my interpretation is true, in the flow experience or yu, East and West meet. In both cultures, ecstasy arises from the same sources. Lord Wen Hui's cook is an excellent example of how one can find flow in the most unlikely places, in the most humble jobs of daily life. And it is also remarkable that over 23 centuries ago, the dynamics of this experience were already so well known. The old woman who farms in the Alps, the welder in South Chicago, and the mythical cook from ancient China have this in common. The work is hard and unglamorous, and most people would find it boring, repetitive, and meaningless. Yet these individuals transformed the jobs they had to do into complex activities. They did this by recognizing opportunities for action where others did not, by developing skills, by focusing on the activity at hand, by allowing themselves to be lost in the interaction so that their selves could emerge stronger afterwards. Thus transformed, work becomes enjoyable, and as a result of a personal investment of psychic energy, it feels as if it were freely chosen as well. Okay, let's see. Let's read some footnotes here. Ting was cutting up, quote, is in Watson, 1964, page 46, who translated Chuang-Tzu's inner chapters. Some critics, the criticism that flow describes an exclusively Western state of mind was one of the first to be leveled at the flow concept. The specific contrast between flow and you was brought out by Sun in 1987. It is to be hoped that the ample cross-cultural evidence presented in Mr. C and Mr. C, 1988, will reassure skeptics that the flow experience is reported in almost exactly the same terms in vastly different non-Western cultures. The quote, however, is from Watson, 1964, page 97. Whaley, 1939, page 39, is the scholar who thinks the quotation does not describe you, but its opposite, whereas Graham, cited in Crandall, 1983, and Watson, 1964, believe it describes Ting's own way of butchering, and therefore that it refers to you. Very interesting. We'll stop here for now. I hope you enjoyed that, and we will continue our reading next week. It'll be part 2 of chapter 7. Okay, in the meantime, I hope you guys all have a great day, great week, and stay cool out there. Summer is coming. Okay, bye-bye now.